Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. Today's webinar will be about Clip Studio Paint, the analog comicker toolset presented by Emma Vieceli. Before we begin the webinar, there are some housekeeping items I would like to go through. The webinar will be approximately 1 hour long. All attendees will be muted. There will be a question and answer session during the last 15 minutes of the webinar. Attendees can ask questions in the GoToWebinar question box right away. Due to time constraints, not all questions will be answered. The webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be shared on social media and will be sent via email to all registrants and attendees. The panelists for this webinar are Maria Quiñones, myself, and Emma Vieceli. For those of you who connect with us for the very first time or have never heard about Clip Studio Paint, Clip Studio Paint is your all-in-one solution for studying, ready to publish, illustration, comics, manga, and animations. Learn more at clipstudio.net/n and graphicsly.com. Also, we'd like to encourage you to share your Instagram stories with the hashtag webinar at Emma Vieceli, at Graphicsly, at Wacom, and at Clip Studio Official. We'll be sharing your Instagram stories if you tag us. Emma Vieceli has been a freelance comic creator, a comicker since 2007, and was creating long before that as a hobbyist. Whether writing, drawing, or both, she uses comic first and foremost as medium for story and emotion. She's known, among other titles, as the writer of the Life is Strange series, the artist of the Modern Frankenstein, and the co-writer and artist on Breaks. So with that, I will leave you with Emma and her presentation, Clip Studio Paint, the analog comicker's toolset. Thank you so much.
Hello, good evening. And Mario, I heard you worrying. You said my name perfectly, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
So good evening, guys. Welcome. I was saying to Mario before we started that I used to do a lot of these sort of workshops, and I often can see faces while I'm doing it. So obviously, what I've got tonight, you're going to have me talking at you, and I can't see you or hear you. So I apologize if I suddenly go off on a tangent, or I hope when we get to the questions, hopefully I'll have covered a lot of things you might have to ask, but otherwise, yeah, obviously let Mario know your questions and we can deal with them then. So yeah, I'm Emma, and I've got about an hour to tell you everything about how I use Clip Studio to make comics. That's an awful lot of stuff. Comics are in themselves about 20 disciplines in one, as if any of you are listening or watching who make comics yourself, you'll know this. Obviously, Clip Studio and Wacom are ideal tools for illustration, and we know this, and I'll use them for illustration myself. When it comes to comics, you're taking that illustration and then you're applying it to a different format, a vessel for telling a story, for carrying emotion. You're going to be the director, the writer. You're going to, depending on the jobs you're doing, you're going to be penciling, inking, toning, lettering. And these are all things that I do on Clip Studio. What I thought I would do, because we've got a brief window of time tonight that I'm with you, is I'm going to basically be showing you a few pages and breaking them down to show a few tips and tricks that I picked up over the years that I like to apply. What I will say in advance is that I'm quite a relic. I'm a little bit old-fashioned. So, you know, when I came into comics, it was on paper. And I don't know how many of you out there will be nodding at this, the same as me. You know, I used to go down Staples and I'd photocopy my comics and fold them and take them to conventions. So for me, in my professional career, which has been about 16 years now, pretty much that whole time, I have been the digital artist, but I'm coming from a world before that as a hobbyist of working on paper. So when I'm using digital software, what I tend to like to do is use it as, I'm basically finding ways I can achieve digitally what I would achieve on paper. And for that, I have never found anything that does what Clip Studio does. I was using it when it was called Manga Studio, because unlike some other softwares, although it carries illustration fantastically, it was originally designed as a comicker's tool. So there's an awful lot in it that can be applied directly to comics, which is wonderful. So as a quick, you should be seeing my screen now, hopefully. So the comics I'm going to be using for the pages I'm going to use tonight are from breaks, and there's a few reasons for that. I've got a couple of slides here just literally showing a few. I've literally gone through my image files to find some comics from 16 years of making comics. So we've got a variety of things here. A lot of the times when I'm working on comics for a publisher, one of the fun things about comics is it's a team game. So often you might be a penciler or an inker or a letterer, and you're working as part of a team. And what that means is that you may have come across the term with actors. We'll talk about a generous actor, and that tends to be someone who in scenes, whether they're filming or on stage, gives a lot back to other performers. And I see comics as something a bit similar. If you're working as part of a team, you're going to be changing your methods to make sure it facilitates what everyone is after doing. So examples of that might be if I'm doing the artwork for a comic, and I'm working with a colorist, which I often do. So a lot of these pages you're seeing right now that I'm scrolling through, most of these are with colorists, some wonderful colorists, because I am not a colorist myself. I will want to close my lines a little more for them, make things a little neater, a little cleaner for them, because I want them to be able to see clearly where areas are broken up on the page. And then there's some things that aren't so obvious. So for instance, lettering, depending on a letterer you're working with. When I get into my second page of examples, I'm going to be talking about storytelling and layouts a little bit and how I use the software for that. And there are subtle elements to storytelling on a page that you have to work with your whole team on. So a letterer, I've done projects before with letterers who maybe feel more comfortable, or the way they work is they tend to work within the panels. This will make more sense when I go into the pages, but I'm someone who, when I approach a page, if I've got complete control over a page, which I do for breaks, which is why I'm using breaks for this webinar, I see the page as a whole, so I use the panel gutters, I use space, which is something I have the luxury of doing when I'm controlling a page. But if you're working with a letterer and they're maybe not going to use the panel gutters, that's something to bear in mind. So all of that is a long-winded way of saying I'm going to be using breaks tonight because it is a project that A, is very dear to me. I co-create the story with Malin Ryden, and then we wrote the story together. She does the majority of the script work. Then I take that script, do an edit, add bits, and then from that point on, I comic the series. So that's including everything, the art and the lettering and the toning and preparing for print, etc. And I do all of that on Clip Studio. Just testing this is still on. So what you can't see that I've got in my left hand at the moment is the Clip Studio Tab Mate. I don't know how many of you are using those, which I love. It's like a little remote control basically that just means I can control elements of the page. It's got a trigger that I use as my delete button. So it's like every time I don't like that line, get rid of that line, trigger button. So I've got 3 pages set up that I'm going to use to talk you through. The first page, I'm going to go through basically the basic approach to a page, the order I'd use it, and the tools that I use. And then we're going to go into some more nuanced, detailed things in the later pages. If we get that far, I'm going to watch the time carefully. I do talk a lot. I apologize. So Mario is going to be ready to jump in and tell me to shut up if needed. But we'll see how far I get. So what you're looking at right now are the rough pencils on a page, hopefully. So let's take it back to the absolute basics. This line here, with any page you're setting up that's going to be for print, you may have come across the terms bleed and trim. So these are dictating where your art's going to sit on the page and what's likely to be cut off when you're printing. With breaks, again, I'm in control of it. So basically I give myself a boundary line, and I know that any of my key art is going to sit inside that boundary line. Anything outside of that, I may lose some in the trim. I'm not going to go into that in detail tonight. So when I'm doing my roughs, let's zoom that up so you can see it properly. Something that's quite funny with breaks, it's one of those comics where we wanted it to look a little bit kind of raw. What's funny about that is I decided that instead of inking it with ink tools, I was going to ink it with digital pencil tools, which we'll look at in a minute. But because of that, I wanted my roughs to look I want them to contrast with what I'm going to be inking over them. So because of that, I actually ended up using a pen for doing my roughs. So I kind of do my roughs in a form of pen, and I do my neats in a form of pencil. What you're looking at here, these lines are, and you're going to see his tool a lot over the course of the next hour. There's a chap called Eric Anthony J, who apparently has done sessions like this with Clip Studio before. If I just share, so you can see in my subtool menu, if I zoom that out, you can, it's not expanding the actual little names, but basically his tool sets are fantastic. I've downloaded a load of his pencils, his pens, some paper textures from him. They're very reasonably priced and they're great. So that's my plug for Eric Anthony J. So what you've got here is using the Jinx tool. And I use that for my roughs. It's a really small thing. I like my roughs, well, most people would like roughs being in a different color because when I'm inking, inverted commas, with my pencil tool over the top, it's going to be in black or just off black. Little small thing that's useful. You don't have to be working in a different color. You can, if I use, let's actually select one of the Jinx tools. So if I'm drawing on the page in any old color, if I want that layer to then change to the color of the rest of my pencils, just color wheel down here, select a color, edit, and convert to drawing color, and that will change the entire layer. So you can work in whichever color you want, and then a nice easy way to change all the colors afterwards. So the very first thing I tend to do when I approach a page to take these away, because that was a sneak peek of the roughs, is weirdly I will letter first of all. Now there's a lot of reasons I do this. I was saying about how I approach this as an analog, so it's a digital tool, but what it's doing for me is replicating what I would do on paper. When it comes to speech bubbles, there's different ways of approaching them on paper. You might have seen the techniques when people would draw the entire page and then literally cut out speech bubbles from paper and stick them over the top. That's something that we replicate very easily digitally because, as you can see, these are all on their own layer, so anything underneath is going to be sitting underneath them. But actually, when I started drawing comics, what I was doing was actually drawing my speech bubbles into the art as I went. So what I find with Clip Studio is I've found a sort of mid-ground where I'm working manually on the bubbles, but I put them in first because I want to work the art with them. I don't want to like put them on afterwards. I want to plan my pages out by them. So to talk a little bit about the lettering tool, so hopefully you're seeing all my layers. I'm assuming you're seeing all my menus. So every bubble is on its own layer. What this tool does for you, which is so lovely, is every time you letter something, much like when you're toning, you can see how I've just clicked that button, so the cursor's come up to right and it has formed a new layer, a text one layer. So anything I type now is going to be in its own layer. The software does that for you automatically, so you don't need to put it on its own layer. The default is it's going to go onto its own layer. If anything, if you want to have something like some of my you can see some of these bubbles are joined because I like having joined bubbles. If you want to do that, what you want to do is select your cursor quite close to the top one. You'll see one bigger square appears around them, and that means that it's now treating those as one single layer. If you want to make sure you've got another bit of lettering that's not anything to do with that layer, if you click far enough away, you can see the difference. That's now its own cursor on its own layer. What's lovely about the treatment of them automatically going into one layer is that then when we go over to our speech bubbling tools, again, preferences, everyone's got their own preferences, depends how you want to do it. In my relic old-fashioned way, I like to use the balloon pen because it is manual. you can just use pre-shapes and put balloon tails on. Personally, I like to draw my bubbles. It just means I feel like I've got complete control over them, and also I can then do, you'll see later on, I can make some interesting shapes with those bubbles. And when I say everything is treated its own layer, let me just check, where's my, you can guarantee I'm going to have one thing not open that I wanted to show you. I thought I had everything open. I'm looking for the subtool detail. So you can see down here, the reason those bubbles came up with brown behind them is because at the moment my background color is set to that. I don't want that. I'm going to set the fill color to be the same as the other speech bubbles. And then the main can be black, that's fine. So you can see you've got your line color, your fill color. So so when I make those bubbles, even if I put my two bubbles far apart from each other, because they're on the same layer, if I then do that, it then connects them up, and I can manually put apparently this character saying her, which is a really great line. But you can see that's basically how everything on the page has been made. So all the, like any software, all the lettering is adjustable. You've got bold options. Again, it being Clip Studio, there are lots of fonts you can download and install. I have a few favorites that I go to. Everything in breaks, I use a font called Hometown Hero. I think my fonts largely have either been bought from Blambot or Comicraft. There's good sites out there, especially if you're printing a comic. It's nice to buy a font, you know you own it. Anyway, so that So generally I will like to put my lettering in first. I might not put all the speech tags in, like the actual little tails, but I will put the lettering in, because what that means is that then I can sort of plan my roughs with an idea of what I'm trying to tell on the page. Paneling, I'm going to talk about in more detail on the next page in terms of how you can use layout as a director on your page. This is going to be a relatively simple one. So let's jump back to the pencils that I had up before. So what you're seeing on here as well is panels, basically. There are tools on Clip Studio, again, that will help you with your panel cutting. Personally, again, going back to me as the relic and the analog idea of comicking, there are two ways I tend to do my panels. Either I literally use the figure tool, so I could literally do, and you can see in the roughs is how I've done it, is I will literally choose my width. I think when I used to work on paper, I was like, oh, by the millimeter, make sure everything lines up. As I've got older, for me, comics is about storytelling, and especially one like Breaks. It's raw, it's emotion. I'm not so worried about it being technically perfect to the millimeter, so long as it conveys the story. But yeah, this is like a quick, easy way if you want to manually make your panels. What I do with Breaks, again, because we like it to be a little bit rougher and more natural looking, is I actually manually draw lines. How many of us can draw a straight line? One of the hardest things to draw, right? But I kind of like the effects I use. So when I'm doing my finals, and I say this as if I'm doing them currently, I actually finished drawing Breaks. 10 years it was running. It finished about 4 months ago. I use a pencil called Tilt-A-Sketch. So you can see in my menus here, I've got quite a few of them, just for different thicknesses, for different things I'm using. And I even have one, my 20 width one that I call Tilt-A-Sketch panel. Nice and helpful, so that when I'm feeling stupid, I can tell that is for panels. So it's a slightly thicker, darker version of the pencils I use for everything else. So with that, I don't use a ruler. As you can see, I literally just draw them in. And your comics are your comics. You make them look how you want to look. If you want them to look really neat and use a panel line, that's fine. If you want to rough them out, that's fine too. There is no right or wrong way, so long as it tells your story. So panel lines in. And again, with this page, I'm not going to go too deeply into the actual storytelling and paneling, because I'm going to move on to that in other pages. But I would then move on to the all vital lines layer. So basically, I was saying before, I wanted it to contrast with my roughs. The roughs are done in like a very dark ink layer. And then obviously just to turn them right down while you're inking over the top. So again, to differentiate Breaks from other projects, again, if you get in really close, they're not super neat. You know, you can see they're kind of rough, they're kind of scrappy. And if I remove the roughs and remove my boundary line, get rid of those, you start to get more of a sense of how the neat lines are going to look. You'll see some gaps. Those are there for a reason. I'll show you in a moment. But yeah, they're not super neat. By the time you're getting into print, they're going to print fine. The general rule I used to be told, I don't know how true it is now, is that if you're zoomed out to 50% and they look great on screen, then they're going to look fine in print, which is a nifty. I work at 600 DPI, by the way. That tends to be, it's a high DPI, but it's what I like to work at. I've done pages for Marvel and they've worked at 300 DPI, so it really, I'd say part of it's personal preference. It's also down to which publisher you're working with and what DPI they want you to work to. But yeah, a little bit of scrappy, never hurt anyone. And Breaks especially is designed to look a little rough. I've got a page up here of something else I'm working on at the moment for a publisher. And this one's going to be with a, you're not seeing this. This is going to be with a colorist. So you can see the difference. This one is using an ink tool, and I'm not showing it tonight, but in case you want to know, the ink tool I use is called a Regular Izzy, is the name of the inks that I like to use. And basically I close the lines a bit more. It's a little bit neater because then it's a bit fairer on a colorist, but we are not looking at that tonight. We are looking at my scrappy Breaks lines. So there's nothing really to go into about that. It's literally a pencil tool. I literally draw it. And while I'm drawing it, I would obviously have I either have the speech off or I'd have it down so that I can see what I'm working with. And what it means is that as I go and I put panels in, I can start to shift speech bubbles around. And it's lovely when you've got control of a page like this, because you can kind of build it organically as you go. If you draw a panel in a certain way and you're like, oh, actually, I'll just shift that speech bubble over. Obviously, again, if you're working as part of a process and a team, you're not always going to have that luxury, but that's what makes this project different and why I wanted to use this one. So once those are all in, we start to get into some of the more specific to Clip Studio little tools. So the gaps that are on the page are because I have ruler layers. Da, 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 da. You should now see a load of blue and purple lines over the screen. The rulers tool is hands down one of the most useful time-saving tools that has ever been created for a digital artist. So some of you may well be used to working with perspective rulers, and what I would normally do on paper is I would choose my perspective points and I would draw my ruler grid, my perspective grid, and then I could add my backgrounds on. What the rulers tool on Clip Studio is doing is what I alluded to at the beginning. It's taking what you would do on paper and just making it quicker. So if I take that off for now because I want to just show you. Like a lot of things when you're working digitally, this doesn't mean you don't need to learn perspective, sadly. You still need to know how perspective works, and if you spent ages learning it, don't worry, it's not wasted. You still need it. The only difference is that the digital tools are just going to give you shortcuts into how to use it. So if you go into your rulers tool, I've got perspective ruler chosen. You can see that on this panel, I'm hoping you can see my cursor when I'm pointing. On this panel, you can see Emma, who was doing her rough pencils, has a rough idea of where she wants things to sit. So I would literally create my perspective line. So I'm going to put one there, I'm going to put one there. So my vanishing point is over here. That's vanishing point 1. And then I can't remember exactly where I wanted it. Let's say, I don't know, let's bring it kind of over there. I quite like things on a little bit of a slant. It's quite nice as well. So literally you can see what that's done is it's created. You can select to show the entire grid. I don't want to see the whole grid, but it's given me my lines. If you want to, you can select the object tool over here. And once your rulers are down, you can then check that things are in line with where you want them to be. So you can see on there, I just want to make sure that that's in line with kind of roughly where I wanted the wall of the restaurant to be. And then once they are in, the magical part is that whatever you draw on this layer will only draw on your perspective rulers. It is amazing. I can't say enough how much time that saves. You don't have to draw your grids. And much like the lettering, every time you use a ruler tool, it's going to default to creating it on its own layer. So one thing to be aware of is on mine, it will always create a perspective ruler to where you were. So I was on the roughs, which is why it created the perspective ruler right above the roughs. So then obviously just slide it up to where you want it to be. That I'm speaking quickly because I'm already aware of how much time we've gone through. I've not even gotten to the second page. So that's basically how I've laid the rulers down on this page. Each ruler for each panel is on its own separate layer, super useful. So if we add them into the mix, take away the roughs, there's how our page is looking. Oh, little thing, really useful when you're on your ruler layer. If you left click on there, you've got a little menu. Everything has handy menus on here. You can either delete the ruler. I generally will always set a ruler to show only when editing layer, because if you don't do that, whichever layer you're working on, you're still going to see that ruler. You want to make sure, ideally, unless you want it to permeate through your whole file, you just make sure it's set. Just click on the little icon, show only when editing that layer, and then whenever you click off of the ruler layer, you're not going to see the ruler. It will only work when you're on that layer. Super useful. The next thing, so once my lines are all down, for a breaks page, the next thing I'm going to start doing is let's look at some screen tones. Now, again, those of you who've worked manually on comics, you will know the feeling of getting home your massive sheet of screen tone, laying it down, cutting bits out, and everything you're doing on Clip Studio with screen tone is very, very similar to that. It's just a digital, slightly faster way of doing that. And over the years, even I, in my Luddite ways, I have come up with, I've kind of started to learn some fun things that I can do that perhaps I wouldn't even be able to do on paper. They're things I can only do digitally, which is sort of tweaking and using tips in the software. So in my tone layer, by the way, if you're looking at my files and going, wow, everything's so nicely labeled, that's for you guys. It's not normally nicely labeled. If I'm working with a publisher, I'll work a bit harder. If I'm doing my own files, don't worry, they are a mess. I will have hundreds of layers and they are a mess. You know, when you get one errant line and you're like, which layer is that one line on? But these files are nicely labeled for you. So the key tone for breaks is a very, very basic dot tone. So those of you who use the software will know this, but you've got your lovely deposit of tones up here. Key to show you here is a download folder, because if you're buying tones from Clip Studio, that's where they're going to appear, and you can just literally drag them into your tone menus and use them from there. And I've got a couple of specialist tones I've downloaded. I mean, the fun with working digitally is you've got an entire shop. The world is your shop. You can download whatever you want. But actually, my most basic tone on breaks is a super basic. It is there in the software when you first get it, and it is a simple dot tone. And I use 7510 is my dots. And what I will tend to do with that, because you can see on the page that the reason I use it is because we've got this sepia color scheme going with breaks. I want the characters to stand out, and I've used it. There's an awful lot of subtext to breaks pages, and what I like is to use the tone over the whole page, and then I pull the characters out of it. It just sort of makes them stand out, because this isn't a full color comic, so it's coming up with other ways to make things stand out. And tone, much like other things in Clip Studio, if I drag that over, that's going to cover the whole page. Actually, let me take off the one that's under. So that is now the whole page, and as you can see, is now on its own layer. Like so many things. And now what's amazing about that layer now believes it's a tone layer. So if I then select everything on that layer and get rid of it, it still thinks it's a tone layer. And what that means is that now if I choose fill and I choose refer other layers, I will always have close gap turned up as well, guys. Close gap is your friend if you a rough line worker like me. It will just I wouldn't use it for if I'm working with another colorist, but for me, I can leave little gaps in my line art, and the close gap is going to sort that out for me. So this layer thinks it's a tone. If I get rid of that, anything I now do is going to be in that tone, and that includes if I'm going to use a pen, like a pen that would normally just be a pen, it's going to draw as a tone. If I use an airbrush, it's going to airbrush as a tone. Basically anything on that layer now thinks it's a tone. It's so useful, and you can use it for lots of fun things. With breaks, I will either, on a simple panel like this at the top, there's nice space around it, so I can literally just fill in the tone where I want it to be. If there's something a little bit more complicated, I will drag the tone over the whole panel. I will click refer only to editing layer so that the tone will sit over the top of everything rather than picking anything out. And then I will literally, there's probably a quick way, but I will literally manually cut the tone out. And what I love with this is it's basically exactly what I would do with a scalpel and a real bit of tone, you know, like you're just cutting tone. So this is what I mean about using this as a sort of digital version of what we would do on an analog level. And what that means in a small way, which I really like, is that when it's printed, you get that sort of the odd imperfection because it has been manually done. And I like that. It gives me that feeling of an analog comic. So that is my base tone. What else have we got in my little tone folder here? Get rid of that, put that one back up. I've got in here, oh, this is a fun one. So this is actually not a tone. This is another, this is a brush that I downloaded. So I was saying to Mario before that whereas the Eric Anthony J brushes, they're all nicely labeled. Those of you who've played on the Clip Studio shop, you will know there's an awful lot of fantastic brushes and tones, which I don't know exactly what they're called because they're written in Japanese, so I'm not sure. I think the symbol means mizu, so I think it's something, it will be like a form of watercolor brush. It's very, very beautiful. I will show you how it looks. So everything, what layer am I on here? Let's form another layer. It's a lovely brush. It's one that I got last year. When you get a new one, you find lots of uses for it, don't you? So it's something I started to bring into the comic in the last year or so. So I've got it in my tone layer, but it's actually using a brush. But I've done it in exactly the same way. So with this one, I would, for my own manual layer, I would refer to all layers. Love it when things do this. It's actually not playing fair. That's not supposed to be selecting everything. Oh, I know why. Give me a moment, where I shut down extra windows because I didn't want to cover the screen with them too much. No, not you. tool property, apply to connected pixels only. That's the one I did not have open. So that will now only, if you toggle that on and off, it's either going to apply to everything of the same color that you're picking, regardless of whether there's lines breaking up, or it's going to apply only to connected pixels. When I'm working in comics, I find only to connected pixels is more useful, because in exactly a case like this, I might just want to select those bits. I don't want to, I can even come down here and go select that, select that, select that. Hopefully you're seeing the dotted lines, and then I can paint all over it and doo-ba-doo-ba-doo. So that's the kind of thing. I guess it's the equivalent if I was doing it on paper. I might use masking tape and then paint watercolor in there. So you're kind of doing the same thing. You're just clipping off your area and then you're painting in it. This is what I mean about me being a Luddite. It really is taking what I would do on paper, but doing it digitally. The end result is the same, but it's just a little bit of a quicker process. So what else have I got in my tone folder? That's that one. I think I saw a smoke tone in there. Yeah, that's a smoke tone up there. And then I have a hair tone. This is actually, I'm calling it tone. It's not, it's another brush. This is one of these watercolor brushes up here, which I use that. It's nice to mix up some different approaches. Goodness me, it's already 7:30, you guys. I'm gonna whiz through. Shade layer. Shade layer, I do everything in one layer, and I set a layer to multiply. I will not go into that because I'm sure those of you on a panel like this, you probably know exactly how shade layers work. I don't know what level everyone's at who's watching, so I'm trying to whiz through and find sort of useful things. We might have to roll into another webinar with more details. So yeah, shade layer on, highlight. What I like with breaks, because I use a sepia tone, is that when I do want to add like it's a small thing, but adding a little eye highlight, it's, or you can see there's a little bit on the lip there. It's just because of this color scheme. It's simple, but they're things that pull stuff out. Add my bubbles back in. Bada bing, bada boom, it's a page. So we've taken that from roughs to the page. So the main things on this one are the kind of pencil tool, the kind of ink tool, the tones and how you can apply them in different layers, connected pixels versus not connected pixels, using paints in place of tones, and the rulers. So let's get rid of that page. That page is done. Let's find another one. So this one, I don't know if I'm going to get onto the third one. This one, what I wanted to show you was some layout options. So this is a much more complex layout. This is the kind of layout, when I was saying at the beginning about working with a letterer, I wouldn't feel so fair doing this with a letterer, unless it was someone I knew very well and I'd worked with a lot, because trying to explain what I wanted with this would be very difficult. So if I whack my tone on, you can see this bubble down, sorry, my speech on. This bubble down here is what I was saying at the beginning about how with that, the text being made on its own layer, you can do some super interesting things with the bubble tool. So if I just say, I'll just put that down there. So that is now its own layer, as we showed before. And if I now bring my bubble in there, it just adds it to that layer. And then I quite like playing around with this tool. You can make some really unique bubbles. You don't have to. There is the eclipse balloon if you want to just go with standard shapes, and that's fine too. It depends what works in your page. But I wanted to show those ones because, yeah, slightly more interesting bubbles going on. The rest of the page, something crazy is going on. By the way, those of you, if any of you are reading breaks, these are pages from the third arc. So if you haven't read them, apologies for the spoilers, you guys. So these are my roughs here. What I had going on this scene is that I have two scenes happening simultaneously. We have a scene, you can see the rulers are selected there. So if I click off of those, the ruler lines go away. Two scenes happening simultaneously, and I wanted to make sure that each one stood out on its own, and I did that using tones, which you'll see when we build up, so that there's sort of this repeating scene moving in on Cortland in the gym, and then meanwhile there's this conversation with flashbacks happening somewhere else. So I've got some crazy panel lines happening. There's a whole nother webinar I could give just on how to break down pages and storytelling. I do not have time for that tonight, unfortunately. So let's have a look. I have in my notes here, I have something that says lol folder. Oh, yes, we have a lol folder. So the lol folder, this is indeed a lol folder. Right, let's take that out. Let's take out my roughs. Referencing, guys, let's talk referencing. This here is my lovely naked reference doll. I put shorts on him because I felt bad for the poor little guy. I don't know if any of you have got any of these. They're super useful. there's no shame in referencing, whether you're using models, whether you're using obliging friends or family members, yourself. There's no shame in this. So this panel, I think that was the original rough. So you can see I told myself, yeah, there's going to be a dead picture of someone there. Then clearly I brought that in, and then when I penciled over it, that was what I used to get this shape here. So that's why I brought the LOL folder in, and that would have literally been done by copying and pasting an image in, and as with everything, you can change the opacity on it, draw over it. So no shame in referencing, guys. And now you know what my anatomy doll looks like. So yeah, so we've got this crazy setup. So going by things we did on the last page, the panel lines go in, which you saw how that happened anyway. We've got the rulers on this one would go in. Let's turn that down so you can see them a bit more. We have our main line art going in. So everything exactly the same as we just did before, using the same tools as we did before. Let's take our rough lines out at that point. So we've got our clean lines. I'd maybe bring the text in, make sure everything's sitting where I want it. So one thing I want to note here, I was saying at the very beginning about panel gutters, and obviously, again, there's no right and there's no wrong with comics, but I quite like, especially on a page like this, which is very confusing, could be confusing, the speech bubbles become very, very important. Where they sit matters. Also, I find I can maximize the space on the page by going over panel lines, basically break panel lines. Every rule is there to be broken, so long as it's in the interest of the story and the reading. That's all that matters. Add my screen tone in. I don't think there's anything particularly different here other than what I showed you last time, but there should be. Where's my snake tone? Come to me, snake tone. Got it all turned off, that's why. Okay, this tone is very, very key to breaks, particularly if any of you read it, you'll have seen it many, many times. This is the tone that I bought. I specifically wanted a snaky tone. It's very beautiful. I could have drawn this manually. That takes a long time. There's a reason artists have bought screen tones for years and years. It's no different buying digital screen tones instead of manual screen tones, except you can reuse digital ones over and over. And I tend to approach this, again, in the old-fashioned way. I will basically have one giant sheet of screen tone, and then I cut out where I want that screen tone to sit. And on this particular page, you can see that I've got it, I'm using my hand on the screen and you can't see that. I've got it going vertically, becoming stronger each time, which I've done literally through opacity, as we do zoom further and further into this character's head in the vertical panels. And I've done that because it sort of separates the vertical panels out from the horizontal panels. Also context, obviously, reading the scene, the context helps massively. So that is my snake panels. I'm really whizzing now because I have about 7 minutes left. It went so fast. The shade layer goes on. What else have we got in here? A splatter that is using, again, I think that is a downloaded brush. I think that's one of good old Eric Anthony J's brushes. In fact, it is toothbrush, which is, I like this. The toothbrush tool as well is great. If you have, I've seen it used a lot in illustration and I use it a lot. If you want to just like throw some lines, some like white over the top of things, boop, 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 just paint right over my page. Obviously that does not look good, but if you've got like in fact I think I used it, yeah, so you can see it there. That's using the droplet tool, but similar thing, kind of breaking up the lines over the top. Right, I'm gonna whiz because there's something I want to show you on the last page. So let's go to the last page. This page, I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about referencing, this time using a photo reference. Again, there is no shame in referencing. But make referencing your own. Like the last thing you want to do, and I should say that Clip Studio comes loaded with tools that I haven't touched because of my Luddite nature, but it's got very impressive 3D modeling tools. Obviously, those are exactly the sorts of things, if I was clever with 3D modeling, I could use those 3D models and bring those in and create this. Personally, I'm not very good with 3D, so I like to either use reference, use dolls, use models, or find photos that are close to what I want. And I had something that I could specifically use for this. But you can see that when it comes to the pencils, they're not, you know, I don't like to just direct trace something. I'm using it as a reference. You want to make it your own afterwards, adjust things. Otherwise, you don't want to lose your personal touch on your artwork. So referencing is totally fine, but don't lose the soul of what you're creating, basically. you can see on here, I've got a rough panel border down the bottom, but actually when it came to the final page, I'm literally jumping here. I got rid of that panel because for storytelling reasons, I wanted it to be open. I wanted to explode that moment out of the panels. That again comes down to storytelling, which I'm not covering today. Let's see what I had to show on this page. I have 4 minutes. So again, the text would go on first. I think the only stuff that's different on this page is I've used a little bit of opacity on some of the speech bubbles here, which is because I want this to be a sort of the character in these sliver panels up here is sort of they're observing what's happening and they're sort of speaking quietly in the background. So think everything you do in comics, and I love that we have the tools here to be able to do that. This is something I couldn't do very easily on paper. This is a very digital kind of thing to do. Just question why, like why are you putting that thing on the page? Is it in the service of the story? So in that case, I've used the speech bubbles on this one. So lines on. This is what I wanted to pull out on this. Here's something. It is possible to do this manually, obviously. It would take a long time. What I've done, I wanted to create a text tone. This is sort of, I've done this a few times in breaks where we have an internal monologue. Let me just pull up the rest of the page because it will be the last thing. So again, you've got the snake tone around. You've got a few different tones happening in there. You can see that I've lost a ruler somewhere. There's a ruler up there. That's a sound effect up there. This one's not as well layered, is it? So the 2 things I wanted to pull out of here, yeah, this text tone. So what I did with that is, as with usual, as I've shown before, working on text, let's say we have let's do a what again. So as default, your text is going to be on its own layer and it's going to be editable. At any time you can go in there and you can edit that text. If you left click on most things in Clip Studio, you have the option to rasterize a layer. Once you rasterize a layer, it becomes, you wouldn't be able to edit it as text anymore, but it becomes basically an image file, so you can do whatever you want with it. And this is fun combined with text. So if I rasterize that, so as you can see, even if I click, I've got my my text cursor up, it's not going to let me do anything because it's now just an image. But it does mean I can duplicate that layer a few times. I can put that down there. Let's put them together into one. So these are now like a text image. I can do things like select white down there, convert to drawing color. I can change the color of them. I can use the transform tool, change the size of them. And what I did for this down here is using the transform tool. I realize I've just used a shortcut on the tab mate to do that transform, by the way, but the actual place it hides is in there. So transform is in there, and you've got a few different options to transform. And what I was using for down the bottom there is mesh, and mesh transform. Super useful if you want to, like, say you're putting someone's looking at a photograph on a comic and you've taken that photograph from a straight on panel previously and you're going to put that photo, but the photo that's being held on the page is at an angle. This is where you can use something like the mesh to basically make sure it fits. Or similarly, if I'm putting like a brick wall down and I'm putting bricks and I'm using a brick tone, but the wall is on an angle, I can lay a flat down brick tone and then use mesh transform to add perspective to it. So that was one of the things I wanted to show on this page. And the other thing, and it will be the last thing I show quickly before we go into questions, is this. Again, this is something that can be done manually, but I love that it's so easy to do on Clip Studio. So we've got a character here. As you can probably tell, it's quite a dramatic scene. It's a big moment in the comic. Things are hazy. This is a technique I've used before for if something is moving very fast as well. And it's basically duplicating line art and changing the opacity on it. So on this particular panel up here, I've actually used so let's go with the double line is down here. So if I get rid of that one, so you can see that there's basically the standard line art there, and then a double line, and it's literally just copy and paste your line art and move it a little bit, and it gives you this amazing sort of slightly woozy effect. It's such an easy thing to do digitally and not something that's very easy to do manually. So it's one of those times where my Luddite brain has switched onto something digital. And then up here, he's not in a good way, bless him. So we've actually got a triple line. So if I get rid of the actual lines, you can see these are the the extra lines. So it gives you that sort of blur effect. Super useful if you're, I mean, you can use the filter, of course. There are blur effects up here. Again, there are tools digitally that can do things for you. But if you're like me and you like the feel of having control over something and feeling like you're working analog, even though you're digital, then this is a nifty way of doing that quickly digitally. I am showing it as 7:46. I feel like I've just talked 10 to the dozen. I hope some of what I've said has been helpful in any way. There's so much I could cover. Comics are vast. But I think at this point, I turn you back over to Mario.
Well, thank you so much, Emma. It's been a wonderful presentation. We are sorry that our time is so limited,
Ah,
but
fine.
I believe you covered everything that you had in mind. So thank you for that. And also thank all of you who are joining us live. I asked from where were you watching the webinar?
Oh, yeah.
And there's people from South Africa like
Ah,
Fernandus, Magali from
oh,
France, and Marie from New
wow.
Zealand, Gray from USA, Ebony from Germany, John from
Ah,
Philippines, Claudio from Italy, Christian from Germany, Mallory from Tanzania, Arian from Canada, well, more
I
people
am
from,
very, very honored. Thank you guys. I hope you found it useful. That's amazing.
yeah, thank you, people from Iran like Sarah, etc., etc. So thank all of you. And let's go with some questions. The first one is from Cristina Perez. I have a question. How do you define the moods in a panel? Is it something related to the script or artistic vision? What do you think?
So I mean, in terms of if you're working with a writer, then obviously the mood, you've got to go by the script. If you're working as an artist and you're given a script, you work to the script. I don't know if you mean how do you define it or how do you show a mood, maybe. So there's stuff I could tell about context within a page. There's a few rules that I like to bear in mind when I think of myself as a director on the page. So imagine that you're holding a camera and that you've got actors. And so if a mood is a
Yes.
very internal, so I mean this is the page I've still got up. So this panel here, we're zoomed right in because this is a very internal moment. The mood here is not good. We want to see what he is thinking. This isn't about a wide view moment. So you've got stuff like a zoom. You've got tools like if you've got a few panels in a row that are all the same size and the same dimensions, you'll get the sense that that's a quick edit, like something's happening very quickly. Whereas if you turn a page and you've got a very open panel, that's giving you this sense that you've zoomed right out and things are peaceful. So in terms of frantic mood versus calm mood, you can use your paneling. Then you've got light and shade, which seem obvious, but obviously if some of the most powerful moments in comics, especially black and white comics, I mean manga and manhwa and black and white comics have only black and white to work with, so they're fantastic for evoking mood with what tools they've got. So for instance, you might have a scene where things are getting worse and worse and worse and the page is getting darker and darker and darker, and then suddenly you turn a page and it's just a clear, like an open white space with one speech bubble in it. That's powerful for a mood. So think about tone, think about pacing, and that's not even including your actual drawing. You know, there's so many tools at your disposal.
And there's another question from Winter Powell. How do you edit your word bubbles? When I save and come back, I can't get to
Yeah.
edit. I end up making a new bubble on top of the old one.
Ah, so I mean, so long as they stay on their separate layers, I wonder if you've got some of your settings. For me, if I open one of those pages that I just had open that had the speech bubbles on their own layers, they should still all be on their own layers. And so any of those, I should be able to click on them, and as you can see, it brings up the edit tool. And similarly, if I bring up the balloon pen now, I should still be able to work on that layer. So I don't know why you're losing that. The only thing I can think is if you export pages, what Clip Studio will do, if you're exporting to then maybe reopen in another bit of software, you will lose the ability to edit your text. Like it will keep them on a separate layer, but you won't have the text editing tools. So it might be that. But if it's within Clip Studio, you should be able to close a file and open it, and they should still be editable. I'm really sorry. I don't know why yours wouldn't be in that case. Sorry, that's not
Mm,
really helpful.
Thank you, Emma. Another question from Larissa Viero. Thanks for the webinar. Joining from Ireland, I was wondering how long it takes you on average to take a page or chapter from blank page to finished product.
So the ones you've been looking at here, because of the nature of breaks, it's a story I know back to front. I know the characters so well. Malin and I have been living this story for a long time. So generally, when I get a script, I already have a good idea of how I want to lay it out. I would say I can probably do from roughs through to finals in about 5 hours, maybe. But this is a slightly unusual project. If I'm working on something, so the page that you saw briefly that I showed that was a fully inked one, that's something I'm working on at the moment. That one I'm maybe roughing out. So my roughs I'm maybe doing about 3 pages a day. So that's probably taking, like 2 to 3 hours each. And then I ink 1 page a day. So that's a much slower process, but that's because I'm working with a publisher and it's just a different way of working, and I want everything to be a little bit cleaner, a little bit neater. So yeah, when it comes to something like Breaks, which is made as a web comic and I want it to have that slightly rough thing, I'd say probably like 5 to 6 hours, depending on how complex the page is. That's going to change things. But if I'm working on pages for a publisher, I generally want to do between 3 and 5 pages a day roughing it, and normally, ideally, 1 page a day inking it. But again, if it's a particularly complex page, if it's got like a load of complex backgrounds, then I might take 2 days inking it. It's so varied. It depends what you're drawing, what your style is, who you're drawing it for, and what your team needs. Unfortunately, with comics, hitting deadlines is a massive part of the job. So one of the hardest things to learn in this job is to let go. Sometimes you just have to be like, you know what, it's not perfect, but it's better that I get it in on time and get it printed, because trust me, it doesn't matter how perfectly you work, you're always going to see flaws with your own work, and that makes you a good artist. If you see flaws, that means you're still learning. That's a good thing. The day you look at your work and go, it's perfect, that's a problem.
Thank you so much. Another question from Aki Fukuoka. How did you start working professionally, not just doing comic as a hobby, but actually signing contracts with publishers?
So I had an interesting route in. Everyone has a different route in. You'll speak to 10 people, they'll all have a different story. With me, I was doing comics for fun because I was part of a group called Sweat Drop here in the UK, who we formed as an independent, like little publisher. It started as a group of us who would literally go to anime cons. We would photocopy our comics. We'd sit behind a table and we'd share the cost of the table, and we'd sell those comics for like 50p, and they were terrible. Like, speaking of my own, they were, but they were fun. It was very much a hobby. Sweat Drop got more serious over the years, and then my path into doing it professionally, for starters, with comics, you've got to make comics to learn how to make comics. You can spend years on a portfolio, and it's never going to be the same as making a comic. And in comics, it speaks volumes for you to be able to say, here's one I printed myself. That independent comics really matter in comics. But we actually, as Sweat Drop, started running a lot of workshops and functions, and I actually started running the Comic Village at an MCM event in the UK. So I would actually facilitate other comic creators, and I wanted to sort of help build community, and that's what Sweat Drop did a lot. We had forums, we ran workshops, very much as people saying, hey, we like doing this, it's fun, why don't you try doing it, it's fun. And through that, I met quite a lot of people. And then in 2005 or 2006-ish, I entered the Tokyo Pop Rising Stars of Manga competition. So competitions are worth entering. There's also from Future Shock with 2000 AD to like the Manga G-Man competition in London. There's always competitions around. I think Jonathan Cape pulled an award, the Observer Prize. They're worth trying. But also around the same time, a company called Self-Made Hero were looking to do Shakespeare, like adaptations of Shakespeare. And it was one of those cases where it just happened that because we'd already been for years doing workshops, we knew someone who mentioned Sweat Drop to that publisher. So it happens, you kind of have to be in a right place, but you can help put yourself in the right place, which often in comics comes down to being at conventions. Get yourself, find out what events are happening near you, print your comic, get a table, sit behind it. So I was probably printing and making comics for a good 10 years before I was doing them for a job. It was something I always thought was going to be a hobby. But I didn't really go the traditional route of art college and portfolio reviews. And And that's another nice thing with comics. Obviously, some people will get in through portfolio reviews, and some people will have gone to art college. For me, I am very much a feely creator. I didn't learn through art. I've not done art, so it was very much learning because I wanted to tell stories. I didn't go into it to be an artist as much as to be a storyteller. And for that, the single best way of getting into comics is by just making those comics and independently selling them, and then approaching publishers with what you've made. But that said, if you're someone who wants to go to portfolio reviews or enter competitions, there are avenues like that. Again, it's a complicated answer because there's so many different ways of doing it. But we're living in an age now where, thanks to the internet and conventions, it's certainly a lot easier to talk to people or listen to webinars like this than it was when I was trying to get in, I think.
No, but thank you for sharing your experience. And another question from Brie Bennett. How do you begin a story, whether or not you're the writer? I'm fascinated by your work on Life is Strange.
Mm. Ah, fantastic. Hello, Life is Strange person. So Life is Strange was exciting for me because I was the writer on it. So as you saw with the breaks pages, with those I co-write with Malin, and then I do the art. And on a lot of the comics that I was showing on these pages, these are generally comics where I don't write them. I am the artist for them. Life is Strange was a different kind of project. I mean, if you've been reading Life is Strange, you've probably been following me for a little while. It I loved the game, and the opportunity came up because I was working on breaks at the time, and I didn't have time to take on an art job. And I was drawing Doctor Who, funnily enough, at the time for Titan Comics, and then they got the rights. They acquired the rights for Life is Strange, and I was first approached about drawing for Life is Strange, which I was heartbroken that I couldn't, because at the time I just didn't have the time to do that. So then the editor said, well, would you like to write it? And luckily, I ended up getting to work with Claudia Leonardi and Andrea Itzo, who were an absolutely amazing art team. So it was just such a great team for my first time writing a big comic like that. In terms of where the story comes from, obviously for Life is Strange, as you probably know, there's already a game, there's a world set up. And when I write a story, I do everything from the character out. So I know some people who work on, they might have like a world that they want to tell a story in. Some people might have literally a scene in their head that they're like, huh, what's that scene? That's cool. Let's work out from that scene who's involved with that scene. How did they get to that scene? With me, I'm very much a character writer. So I tend to take character first. I deep dive into them. I think about what they need, what they want, what might change them, where they've come from, and then how I can tell a story that gets them to where I want them to be. And that's what I did very much with Life is Strange, because they're such rich characters to start with. So, and I played the game so much that I was able to get into their heads and think, right, where do these characters want to be? How do I get them to that place? What challenges can I put in their way? If you've got characters in your head, a little fun game I used to play when I did workshops in person is called the Peanut Game. I made this game up. And the idea is, and you could do this for something like Life is Strange, is if your key characters for Life is Strange are sitting in a room, or your key characters from Breaks or from your story are sitting in a room, and in the middle of the room is a bowl of peanuts, ask yourself how each of the characters in the room reacts to the bowl of peanuts. Are they the sort of character who's like, actually, they're always hungry and they don't care about anyone else, they're going to go in and grab a handful of peanuts? Are they someone who's like, oh, well, I kind of want a peanut, but actually, I'll wait and see if someone else takes a peanut first? Are they someone who's going to like pick up a peanut, throw it at someone else who they didn't like in the room, and then change the bowl of peanuts into a dragon? And then think about how that character responds to the bowl of peanuts is going to inform how they're going to respond to a dragon in the room. There's a very short way of explaining the game, but like it gives you an idea of how I like to work from character first. Like, how does that character view the world? How do they think? What do they want? And what challenges do they need to overcome to get that? And Life is Strange is definitely one that I wrote with that in mind. So it's very much like character out.
And here's another interesting question from DL. I'm mainly analog artist who has had a hard time transitioning to digital, so I really enjoyed this presentation.
Oh, great.
Do you have any advice with regards to equipment that has helped you feel more at home, such as tablet, pen settings, or accessories?
Well, you're not alone. Like, as I say, I've been doing this 16 years for a job now, and every now and then I still like miss paper. But I'm saying not so much now, to be honest. Once you click with it, honestly, it's going to make your workflow a lot faster. You don't have to worry about scanning or cleaning up. I don't know if you use a flatbed tablet. So I'm a Wacom gal. I always have been, and I currently use a Cintiq. So for a lot of years, I used a flatbed, so a tablet like that would just like an inch or so would sit on the desk. So I'm drawing on the desk, but I'm looking up to the screen. I think I did that because I thought it was I don't know. I thought if I was working digitally, that's how I should work. And I didn't want to like, if I'm going to work digitally, I don't want to have my hand covering the screen. I then switched to a Cintiq, and I don't know, you might already be using a Cintiq. The thing with a Cintiq is it feels much more like you're working directly on the screen rather than on a flatbed. So for me, that made me feel a little bit more at home because I felt more like, this feels like working on paper. So that helped. With some tablets, it's worth looking into screen covers. You can buy matte screen covers that will make it feel a little bit more like paper, which can be useful, or similarly different nibs for your pen, just stuff that gives you that slight feedback. If I don't know if you work in comics or illustration, but so I literally yesterday downloaded a bunch of Eric Anthony J's. I bought a packet of his paper textures, which sounds silly, but a small thing like having texture. In fact, did I have one of them saved? Oh, I did. So this is, ignore the sketch that's on it. This is literally a paper texture. And there's something fun about using, I don't know, it makes it feel more natural, even though you're working digitally. I don't know how long you've been trying at the digital. Hopefully it clicks with you soon. I do think using the right pens and nibs, so do get onto the stores and see what you can download that feels like a natural pencil. I really like the Tilta sketch pencil. I feel like you can see on that when you're working on that paper, it feels like it just feels right. It looks right. You can kind of trick your brain into feeling like you're working on paper. But yeah, I hear you. I get nervous around too much tech. So for me, it's all about how I can bring my analog techniques onto digital. And honestly, Clip Studio helps massively with that. So I hope it clicks for you.
With those wise words, I think we are closing our webinar due to time constraints.
Okay.
But we want to thank all of you who joined us today. Thank you so much, Emma.
Yeah, thank you.
This has been a wonderful presentation, and I'm going to show one last bit of information to all of you. For all of you who asked, this webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. So remember to subscribe to receive notifications once it's available to watch. For more information about Clip Studio Paint, visit our website clipstudio.net/n and graphicsly.com. Follow both YouTube accounts, Clip Studio Paint channel and Graphicsly, and also for more information about Emma and her projects, don't forget to follow her on her social as Emma Vieceli on Instagram, Twitter, Mastodon, and her website. So with that, once again, thank you so much, Emma.
Thank you.
Thank all of you, and please stay tuned for more webinars about Clip Studio Paint. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.